Welcome back for the second part of our Season of the Witch, the Bell Witch Story documentary series. When we left off, we were discussing the abuses that old Kate would readily heap upon those of the Bell family, and the uncharacteristically kind affections that she seemed to have for Lucy Bell, the family matriarch, even going so far as to attend and care for her when she had fallen ill with some rather serious malady, literally nourishing her back to health with fruits and hazelnuts that she brought her from foreign lands. With no further ado, we will continue with the next chapter in the strange course of events. While the spirit was largely vile and ill-tempered with most everyone else in the family, as we discussed in our earlier segment, the entity seemed to be very kind and accommodating to the mistress of the house, and it is said that whenever Lucy Bell would invite the neighbors over and host a Bible study night, or even a quilting circle, that the witch would certainly be there in attendance, and shockingly would provide fresh fruits and refreshments for those who were visiting. Many of the fruits provided were tropical in nature, and were almost virtually unknown to Robertson County, Tennessee. It was an unknown mystery as to how the witch acquired these luxury fruits, but similar actions were repeated during a birthday party for Betsy Bell, Lucy and John Bell's daughter. On the occasion in question, Betsy had invited over multiple friends from the community for a big old whoop-de-doo, and once everyone had gathered and the dinner had been prepared and placed on the table, the spirit chimed out saying, "I have a surprise for you. Come and see it." Not knowing what sort of surprise that the witch would have up its sleeve, I'm sure they were all somewhat hesitant to receive the unexpected gift. However, suddenly, a basket was placed on the table by invisible and ghostly hands, containing lush and exotic foods that were not native to Red River. There was an ensemble of pleasant delights such as oranges, nuts, bananas, and grapes. The spirit voice proclaimed to those in attendance, "Those came from the West Indies. I brought them myself." The mysterious partygoer then encouraged the young folk to eat and be merry, and stated it would have brought bottles of wine, however the preachers would not have approved of it, so while it demonstrated some of the most terrible behavior imaginable, it also at times proved that it could bless others with small acts of kindness. It is still an unsolved conundrum as to why the spirit spake to Lucy Bell in an entirely different manner than it did with anyone else in Red River. Old Kate took the time to question Lucy Bell about her household duties and her financial business, and would offer advice as to what it felt was the best course of action, and in most cases, Lucy would heed such advice. Day by day, the spirit would recount and share with Lucy what her relatives in North Carolina had been up to, and how all of her family members were doing, and even Betsy would sometimes share in the good fortune of the Red River Witch, especially after the death of John Bell. It would make sure to tell Lucy, or Luce, as she called her, to watch after Betsy and try to make her happy. It would go even further to ask Betsy if it could not bring her some rare delicacy for her to eat, which it did many times. It has never been known for sure why the sinister spirit suddenly descended on the innocent Bell family, and I'm willing to believe that it will never be known, or at least on this side of heaven, because it has been stated that no man, except perhaps Job from the Bible, has ever been made to suffer more than John Bell, for no known reason. However, having said that, there are certain other historical examples that bear a similitude to the events that plagued the Bell family, and at least provide interesting connections to the Bells' particular haunting, such as the case of the stone-throwing devils in New Hampshire, or the fascinating account of Lulu Hurst, or even the infamous Salem Witch Trials. And it is through the witch trials that we find an interesting potential association between Salem and one Lucy Williams Bell. Now, earlier we briefly mentioned that there are some surprising and possible coincidental connections between the Bell Witch haunting and the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. And while these two differing events are separated by some 125 years, there is a startling similitude that seems to tie the two events together. In fact, there are so many unusual associations between the two that we feel that we cannot allow them to go unmentioned. If you will allow, I will now give a brief rundown of the Salem affair, just to paint a picture. Sometime in 1692, a series of events took place involving 9-year-old Elizabeth Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, born Abigail Rogers, who were the daughter and niece of Salem's minister Samuel Paris, and the events eventually led to a witch hysteria and resulted in the deaths of 25 people who were killed during the witch trials in Salem. 19 people were executed through hanging, and 5 others died in jail, and one unfortunate soul was crushed to death according to the Boston Globe. The story goes that the Paris family had a slave in their home who went by the name of Tituba, and there is some debate as to Tituba's nationality because some sources say that she was a Native American Indian, some sources say that she would have been a South American Indian, and still others say that she was from the Caribbean, aka the West Indies, where the Bell Witch claimed to get her exotic fruits that she gifted to Lucy and Elizabeth Bell. It is kind of ironic to me that both the Bell incident and the Salem Witch Trials both involved a Williams, as Lucy Bell's maiden name was Williams, and an Elizabeth. Years ago, I interviewed a man who had a shop above the Bell Witch Museum, who told me in no uncertain terms that he had evidence that one of Lucy Bell's relatives were directly involved in making false accusations at the Salem Witch Trials, and he believed that the Bell Witch haunting was a curse or punishment revisited upon the Williams family for the part they played in the Salem trials. It was his testimony that set us to even start looking at Salem in association with the Bell Witch haunting. Although some of the things we found are curious at best, I will try not to allow my train of thought to stray for now, and get back on track with Tituba, whose nationality no one can seem to agree upon, as descriptions of her seem to evolve from Caribbean to South American Indian to Native American Indian to half Indian to half black, then entirely black. For whatever reason, the two girls, Abigail and Elizabeth, began to suffer from fitful contortions of the body, and they began exhibiting uncontrollable eruptions of screaming, and some sources of research state that the two girls suffered from an unseen supernatural entity who was guilty of pinching and biting them. The local doctor in Salem, one Williams Griggs, would end up diagnosing this as bewitchment that stemmed from the supernatural. It would seem that following this diagnosis, some of the other girls in the neighborhood appeared to have similar reactions and presumably were also considered to be suffering from some sort of bedevilment. In February, a warrant for arrest was issued for Tituba, the slave of the Paris family, along with a couple of other women in the community, such as Sarah Good, a homeless woman, and Sarah Osborne, a less fortunate elderly woman. All of these women were specifically accused by the children as being guilty of witchcraft and placing some kind of curse on them. Tituba denied the guilty accusation while being interrogated and being asked questions such as, "Why do you hurt these children?" To which she replied through somewhat broken English, as English wasn't her strong suit, that, "I no hurt them at all." However, she would later recant on her previous statement, saying that, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." The Salem town justice asked her, who was it who tortured the girls? Tituba replied, "The devil for all I know." She described that a tall, white-haired man in a dark serge coat had appeared to her, and he forced Tituba to hurt the Salem girls, and that he would take her life if she refused to do so. And this man, who would change in Tituba's description I should add, would show her a book bearing the names of the other women who are witches, or at least said to be witches, and presumably many others who were knee-deep into the mystical arts. One of the more prominent aspects of Tituba's testimony was her personal sighting of numerous strange animal creatures that defy modern explanation. She claimed that she sighted a hog, a yellow bird, a red cat, a black dog, a ghostly translucent cat, and interestingly enough, a strange hairy creature that walked on 2 legs. She described seeing another unusual creature, but seemed to find great difficulty in describing it and putting it into words, and while she didn't know what it was called, she described a winged creature with 2 legs, but it bore the head of a woman. Tituba was apparently very detailed in her accounts, and at other times very vague regarding the details of her connections with the supernatural and witchcraft, and she made the statement that she had signed her pact with the devil in blood, albeit she was unsure as to how this was accomplished. Supposedly, according to one source, Tituba retracted every word of her confession, saying that her master had bullied her. But she had also claimed to be guilty of pinching the Salem children of several households, so we will never be 100% sure of how truthful Tituba was. There are important details here that need to be brought to the surface. We find the similarity in the case of the Salem Witch Trials that the children, Elizabeth and Abigail, were being pinched by an unseen spiritual entity. We find an alleged witch who supposedly hailed from somewhere in the West Indies. We know from the Bell Witch account that it made multiple trips to the West Indies, sometimes bringing tropical fruits to the Bell home, and when it finally left and came back after 7 years, it told John Bell Jr., "I have been in the West Indies for 7 years. Plus, while we cannot prove it for sure, through Tituba, we have a possible Native American connection to the Bell Witch." Recall that very early on in the haunting, it claimed that it was the spirit of a Native American Indian. Tituba distinctly described the sighting of several strange animals, including a black dog, which we know that strange dogs, and even black dogs, were sighted during the Bell Witch haunting, and even one of the spirits in the so-called witch family was presented with the name of Black Dog. And perhaps I'm looking too hard, but another one of the witch family was named Jerusalem, which in itself bears the name Salem. One of the creatures Tituba mentioned involved sighting a strange bird that was difficult for her to describe. Drew Bell observed a very large fowl, which he supposed to be a wild turkey, as it perched upon the fence, and ran in the house for a gun to kill it. As he approached within shooting distance, the bird flapped its wings and sailed off, and then he was mystified in discovering that it was not a turkey, but some unknown bird of extraordinary size. But perhaps the most prominent connection between the Salem Witch Trials and the Bell Witch haunting comes from Miss Lucy Bell's own heritage. A few years back, as mentioned a few moments ago, we had the chance to speak with a town historian for Adams, Tennessee, and he relayed to us that Lucy was related to a woman who falsely accused other women in Salem during the trials, and that woman may very well have been Abigail Williams. Williams was Lucy's maiden name, and Abigail did indeed falsely accuse some of the Salem women of witchcraft. But there are more interesting connections than this. There is somewhat of a mystery regarding what happened to Abigail after the trials, but she is said by some to have left Salem sometime during or after the trials, and she would later make her way somewhere along the United States East Coast. Ironically, the Bells, including Lucy, came from North Carolina along the East Coast, specifically from Edgecombe County, and John Bell would come from Halifax, North Carolina. It is speculated also that Abigail left the United States, where she died somewhere in the West Indies. Is it at all possible that Abigail Williams was an ancestor of Lucy Williams? And perhaps Abigail's accusations of innocent women, which undoubtedly led to multiple deaths, set the course of events for the Bell haunting in motion? The links between the two cases are indeed fascinating, and if anyone else finds any other connections between the two, I would certainly be interested in hearing it. We just mentioned a moment ago as well, an association between black dogs, the Bell Witch, Salem, and even the supernatural hound of the British Isles, Black Shuck, which in some cases was as large as a horse. And quite earlier back in part 1, we discussed the possibility of dogmen at John Bell's farm, and we relayed to you that Tituba claimed to have seen hairy bipedal creatures, so we've showed quite an unusual kinship between black dogs and the supernatural. Ironically, from what I have read, John Bell's family originated from a long family bloodline of Scottish men, which extended back for many, many years, or at least according to author Charles Price. It is highly possible that John, as a growing boy, was engrossed in tales of Scottish folklore and the supernatural, as the Scottish people were somewhat superstitious in nature. In the old country, unearthly creatures were conjured up and blamed for events for which man had no explanation. There's been many a tale of bestial black dogs around the world, oftentimes described with red, glowing eyes, but they've been fairly common in England. Black Shuck is probably the most popular name for this satanic aberration. However, throughout other regions, they have other nicknames attributed to them, such as Padfoot, the Hairy Hound, the Girt Dog, Barghest, the Yeth Hellhound, and even the Grim. However, even Scotland is not without a legend of a black hellhound, which goes by this name, which would be foolish for me to make the attempt at pronunciation, so I will show it on the screen. In fact, during research for this video on the Bell Witch, we found an interesting cryptid account from a 1912 newspaper bearing the eye-catching headline, "Bell Witch with Terrifying Scream Abroad in Lauderdale." It seems that in February of 1912, Lauderdale County, Alabama, was plagued with a mystery animal that bore a resemblance to a dog. But perhaps the most notable feature was the high-pitched scream that it emitted. For whatever reason, the sighting of this creature made individuals believe that the Bell Witch had returned and was now wreaking havoc in Alabama of all places. The article states, "The Bell Witch, which many years ago brought terror and destruction to an East Tennessee family, has reappeared, this time in Blackburn Beat, this Lauderdale County, according to the belief of some residents of that place." The Montgomery Advisor, February 24th, 1912. As I stated, the peculiar animal resembled a large dog, but it was said that the most terrifying feature was its scream, which could be heard for a mile or more, and it closely resembled the sound of a woman screaming in terror. It was described as having a reddish-brown coat, with a distinctive white streak of fur on its throat. This creature was so greatly feared that few had the bravery to shoot the creature that was plaguing the county. Multiple newspapers would report on this animal, one quoting their local attorney who said he was firmly convinced that they were favored with an unusual visitation. The Times Daily of Florence, February. The county gained a small sliver of insight into this creature when a local man actually managed to shoot and kill the animal as it was being attacked by his pet dog. This time it was described in the way that it looked like a dog, but was not exactly one. It was an aged creature. Times Daily, April 12, 1912. The man who shot it, Plummer Daniels, also described that its growl was something startling and shook the very ground with its roar. Times Daily, April 12, 1912. Friends, there seemed to be a startling association between the Bell Witch, Salem, the phantom black dogs, and the monstrous cryptid canines. And the connections do not end there. There is yet another story we have not yet mentioned that directly connects witchcraft and the supernatural to a large black demon dog that was even described as bipedal. This particular tale takes place somewhere in the Appalachian regions of the United States, which if you research, you will find that it was the Scottish people who moved into these mountains, because it reminded them of their mountainous homes in the Scottish Highlands. The particular account and reference begins with an elderly man who we will be referring to as Bill Johnson. Bill is making complaints against his neighbors in court on the accusation of witchcraft. This is a harsh and bold claim to make about your neighbors, but what brought about this staunch condemnation was the unfortunate find of a beloved cow that had been violently mutilated. The murder of his cow was certainly in accordance with a ritual attack, as someone had cut off the tail, slit its throat, and left the animal to bleed out. And Bill earnestly believed that his neighbors were the very individuals guilty of this attack. However, due to the outlandish nature of the accusation, the courts ruled that Bill was to be sent to the county hospital and psychiatric evaluation was to be performed to ascertain his mental state. But upon carrying out the evaluation, it was found that, while he seemed very old-fashioned in his beliefs, he was not at all mentally unstable as some believed, and was released. The animal attacks, unfortunately on Bill's farm, would continue, and one of his mules would be found with a broken leg and numerous slices across its body. And as before, It appeared to be the dark work of some sort of ritual attack at the hands of local occultists. But as before, the town's sheriff would rule once more that it was an act of vandalism. These events continued as the Johnsons found themselves beset with a litany of supernatural assailments, culminating on a highly notable occasion. A large black dog squeezed through the gaps between the floorboards of their mountain home and made its frightening entrance among the Johnsons. The hellish hound, thusly described, as it seemed like nothing other than such, raised up on 2 legs to the same height as an adult man, and walked about the home brandishing a gun of all things, and it commenced to fire on the family. However, it would end up missing, and the bullet became lodged in the family's wood-burning stove, whereafter it is said that the devil dog would make its exodus through another gap in the floor. If the Johnson incident truly transpired, then could this account be a documented encounter with what the Native American Indians described as a skinwalker? Could it have been some sort of practitioner of witchcraft that was so deeply steeped into the dark mystical arts that it personated some variety of devil dog or hellhound? Was it a demonic agency bent on accomplishing some unknown purpose or harm to the Johnson family? Or was there simply a human component involved? Or could it even have been a greatly embellished account of the supernatural? Who can say, friends? Following that terrifying encounter, the Johnsons would also meet with a strange ball of blue light, such as described in stories from Adams, Tennessee, and Land Between the Lakes, which also has a history of witchcraft and upright canine creatures. The Johnsons proclaimed that they sighted disembodied shadows that sometimes appeared as a person or the silhouette of a cat, and these shadows would appear to be talking amongst themselves. Other events were said to have taken place on that property that ranged from objects moving of their own accord, animals walking up the sides of barns, and they even believed that their Uncle Gideon had been bewitched to death, reminiscent of the death of John Bell, whom the spirit claimed sole responsibility for his death. The Johnsons allegedly were able to recognize those who had been bedeviling them with sorcery by a set of shadows that manifested in the air, rocking back and forth. And these shadows bore the similitude of some of their neighbors. Ironically, the Johnsons' family trouble began with a disagreement over property, similarly to issues that transpired with the Bells prior to the haunting. As it turned out for the Johnsons, a high-powered land company extended multiple offers to buy their land, which they would end up turning down. The large-scale developers had evidently constructed a sumptuous resort home on the opposite side of the ridge where they held land. And it goes without saying, the land developers very much wanted to purchase it. Apparently, according to the account, some local businessmen revealed that this company had used high-pressure tactics to influence the Johnsons to sell their land, and some have placed confidence that they might have hired the assistance of some town locals to terrorize the Johnson family, perhaps even through local mountain witchcraft, such as an Appalachian granny witch might conjure up. And who knows just what other worldly horrors a family can be made to endure when they are unwittingly at the mercy of a witch's brew. And for those who care to read this account for themselves, this fascinating read comes from Christopher Coleman's book, On the Dark and Bloody Ground, pages 41 through 44. I'm quite surprised by the amount of hauntings, harassments, and oppressions that share so many character traits or similarities, as they often involve a dispute of some sort prior to the events. The hauntings are usually reminiscent of one another, and for whatever reason, many of these anomalous cases will at the very least tie themselves to something cryptid related, or something otherworldly will be seen. In many cases, one or two individuals in a family will bear the brunt of the phantom assailant's wrath, and so it was with the Bell family. It was no secret that the spiritual tormentor seemed to intensely hate John Bell, and would also frequently visit its wrathful attentions upon Betsy and Drury. But if there was one group of people that unfortunately garnered Kate's arcane menacing, it would surely have been John and other neighboring farm slaves. For whatever reason, the spirit had a deep, abiding hatred for the black-skinned slaves, and was often cruel and abusive to them both physically and verbally, oftentimes beating them nearly to death with sticks, stabs, handles, and firewood, many times only sparing their lives because it claimed not to want to upset Lucy Bell, the lady of the manor, whom the spirit seemed to hold in high regards. One very lamentable slave, who was often accosted and abused, was named Harry. Harry, to his great misfortune, was tasked with kindling and maintaining the Bell family's numerous fireplaces. Each morning Harry would gather and chop wood, then bring it into the Bell home, then start and stoke the fires in the open fireplaces to ward off the morning chill. However, Harry was late attending to his fire-related duties for a few mornings, which resulted in a scolding from the master of the house, and he was told to come in earlier and be more diligent. However, the very next morning, Harry was late again, and while he was bowed to his knees attempting to blow life into the coals and make them burst into flame, Harry was assailed and savagely beaten. The very kindling with which he purposed to use in the construction of the morning fire was now being used by unseen hands to ravage his body. Powerful blows of such a magnitude rained down on Harry that they could be heard echoing throughout the house, mingled with Harry's pitiful pleading cries for help and mercy. The unforgiving spirit lifted Harry off the very ground and stretched him across a chair and beat him all the more soundly. So severe, in fact, that his crying and begging for his life alarmed John Bell so as he feared his slave would be killed or end up halt. When the spirit's iron-handed onslaught finally abated, Harry was told by the otherworldly assailant that if he were ever late again, it would beat him to death and throw his body into the fire. Needless to say, that Harry was never late again. The spirit seemed to have some dark contention with Harry, as it made his life more and more bitter by adding to his workload without even getting approval from his owner, going so far as to promise a sick neighbor who lives half a mile away that after Harry had started the Bell family's fire, that he would come over and cut wood and kindling and start their fire, and would do so until they were back on their feet, and it told them, "It will be no trouble. Harry just likes to make fires on cold mornings." I recall from our research a particularly terrible event recorded in Charles Bailey Bell's book, The Bell Witch, A Mysterious Spirit, wherein during some of the slaves' religious ceremonies, such as baptism, the witch would show up and begin to terrify those in attendance by joining in singing, forcing them to sing certain songs, and when the ceremonies began to break up due to their terror, it would firmly tell them to stay there and do their duty, or it would, and I quote, "follow them, throw them into the river, and drown all those converted Negroes, preacher and all." The entity seemed to be a virulent racist of the highest order, and I am loath to even repeat some of the terrible utterances that the spirit made, and I am sorry to utter them myself, even for the purpose of this video. But if I'm going to give as true of an account as I can, then unfortunately I must. I offer humble apologies to anyone offended by this section. It is never easy to report on vile and atrocious acts perpetrated upon another human being. Old Kate seemed to glory in making the slaves' bitter lives much more unbearable, and when one of them came to be baptized that was particularly known for committing sins, the witch would tell the preacher to put him under again and keep him there a little longer. The preacher would always do it. Every now and again, one of those men would come to be baptized again, although they had already been baptized 2 or 3 times before, and the spirit would specifically tell that poor soul to make good this time. "The next time I catch you here, I'm going to have you drowned." If there was any saving grace to these events, the witch would quote scripture to these men and assure them that their preacher was a good man. Also, not to forget that they had just been baptized, so make sure to quit all your sins and be good to each other. It should be noted that, although these events took place prior to the Civil War, and this was still during the period of slave ownership, that John Bell did seem to care and be benevolent to his slaves, both the men and the women, as well as those who worked on his farm. And even to this day, John Bell is buried alongside his slaves. But truly, how can any man lay claim that he loves another man, when he holds his brother in bondage and servitude? Personally, we believe that we should ever be working for the sake of our brother, no matter the color of his skin, but rather the content of his character. But we are here to present the case of the mysterious Bell Witch of Tennessee, and not get into the sociology of mankind. We've covered a lot in this segment, and this seems like a good place to leave off and close out the second chapter. We invite you to continue on with the third part of Season of the Witch, the Bell Witch story, which will be uploaded as soon as we can.